Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's definitely not going to win any awards for spaciousness: medieval bedrooms. If you're imagining something out of a fairy tale castle, prepare to be disappointed. Picture this: a small, cramped room, flickering candlelight casting shadows on the stone walls. The only furniture? A small, basic bed with a heavy woolen blanket and maybe, just maybe, a few other odds and ends scattered around. You might be thinking, that sounds cozy, but, spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't last a day in a room like this. No fluffy pillows, no central heating, and don't even get me started on privacy. Yeah, it's not the dreamy medieval retreat you had in mind. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to post where you're watching from and what time it is. I'd love to know how far and wide our cozy history journey is reaching. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you step into this medieval bedroom, you're greeted by the faint smell of damp stone. The air is cool and heavy, and there's a slight draft that sneaks through the cracks in the walls. The bed sits low, a simple wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress, perhaps covered in a thick woolen blanket that's seen better days. The candlelight flickers in the corner, its soft glow fighting against the shadows that creep along the stone walls. A small fire crackles in the hearth, offering some warmth but not nearly enough to fill the space. The room is tiny, no larger than some modern-day closets, and the bed dominates what little space there is. But here's the kicker. In the medieval world, this was actually considered a luxury, believe it or not. Space was a commodity that wasn't easily afforded, and in a society where most people lived in even smaller, less comfortable conditions, this room would have been quite the step up. It's hard to imagine, right? You think about medieval castles with their grand ballrooms and towering ceilings, but in the private, everyday lives of most people, their living quarters were cramped, unadorned, and practical. And let's not forget that this small room wasn't just a place for sleeping. No, in fact, it was also a multi-purpose space. Imagine trying to fit not just yourself into this small area, but your family, your pets, and any other visitors who might come through. It wasn't uncommon for several people to share one room, and sometimes even one bed. The space was so tight that social and personal boundaries were often blurred. Need to use the bathroom? You were probably doing it in the same room you slept in. That's the kind of close quarters we're talking about here. You probably think this all sounds pretty unpleasant, and you'd be right. But then again, people living in medieval times didn't know what they were missing. Privacy wasn't really a thing. The walls, though stone, were often thin, and the sense of personal space was minimal. Everything in the room was utilitarian. People didn't have closets or dressers, for example. Their personal belongings were either stored under the bed or in a small chest that doubled as seating. The bed itself was often the centerpiece of the room, and though it was small, it had to serve many purposes. One of the first things you'll notice about medieval bedrooms is how dark they are. Without electricity, artificial light sources were limited to candles, oil lamps, and the occasional fire in the hearth. And remember, there were no fluffy throw pillows or soft, plush bedding like we enjoy today. The bed was often just a simple wooden frame with a mattress stuffed with straw, leaves, or even feathers. If you were wealthy enough, you might have a mattress filled with horsehair or down feathers, but for the most part, the average person had to make do with much more humble materials. Now, let's talk about warmth or the lack thereof. On chilly nights, which was pretty much every night, you'd have to rely on the fire to keep you warm. But the fire didn't reach far, and most homes were drafty. The idea of a heated mattress pad or electric blankets, not even close. Instead, people used thick woolen blankets and furs to try and trap warmth. But in these tiny, cramped rooms, that warmth didn't always reach the far corners, leaving cold spots that were hard to avoid. And speaking of blankets, did you know that medieval people would often sleep fully clothed? It wasn't a fashion statement, but rather a survival strategy. A thick woolen tunic could be the difference between staying warm enough to sleep and shivering through the night. There's even some evidence to suggest that people sometimes slept with their boots on to avoid the chill. Imagine going to bed after a long day, not in your comfy pajamas, but in full-on clothing, ready to roll out at a moment's notice. Cozy, right? You'd also likely have a small table or a chest nearby, possibly with a few items that you couldn't fit into your drawers if you had drawers. Of course, there would be no TV, no cell phone, and definitely no fluffy bedspread to snuggle into. Instead, the room was stripped down to its essentials: the bed, the fire, and your basic belongings. But one thing that might surprise you is how much the bed itself could reveal about your social status. If you were of noble birth, your bed would be a lot larger, often more than enough space for one person. But still not luxurious by our standards. The wealthy might have nicer bed linens, finer furs, and even some curtains around the bed for privacy. Again, not something that was common for the lower classes. A larger, more decorated bed wasn't just about comfort. It was a sign of your wealth and position in society. But even for the rich, the space in the room remained cramped. So, while you could afford the fancier linens, you couldn't exactly stretch out and do cartwheels. In essence, medieval bedrooms were defined by their lack of space. In fact, the entire design of a medieval room was based on practicality, not comfort. Everything had to serve a purpose. The fire in the hearth wasn't just for warmth. It was for cooking, for light, and for keeping the room from freezing overnight. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a social hub, a storage unit, and a place to rest. Despite how uncomfortable this may sound, it was the reality of daily life for most people during the medieval period. And if you think about it, this wasn't just confined to the bedroom. The entire concept of personal space was much smaller in medieval times. This room, despite being small and cramped, was still a sanctuary of sorts. A place where you could rest after a long, hard day. Sure, it wasn't exactly a five-star hotel, but for the time, it was as good as it got. As you settle in and get a feel for the space, one thing becomes immediately clear. This room is cozy in the most unconventional way. It's cramped, yes, but it's the sort of cramped that makes you think of your own space, your own personal bubble. But, of course, that bubble doesn't exist here. Everyone shared this tight space, your family, possibly a few neighbors, and if you were lucky, your bed wasn't even the only one in the room. Beds in medieval homes were like a scarce resource, and when you think about it, there really wasn't much you could do with the space available. You didn't have the luxury of sprawling out like you do in a modern bed. No king-sized beds, no luxurious feather pillows. In fact, there was no personal space to speak of. Let's take a closer look at what life was really like in these shared rooms. For most people, there was no such thing as a private bedroom. Bedrooms, if you could call them that, were often more like multi-purpose rooms, shared by everyone in the household, whether they were related or not. Imagine that the same room where you eat, sleep, and possibly entertain guests. The space was often shared not just with family members, but with a few animals too. Yes, animals. It wasn't uncommon to find livestock kept in the same room, especially during colder months, when the warmth they provided could help keep the chill at bay. You might be wondering, how did medieval people deal with the constant lack of space? Well, they got creative. Furniture was sparse and modest. You wouldn't find ornate dressers or full wardrobes like you would in a modern home. Instead, personal belongings were often stored in a simple chest or tucked under the bed. And remember, these weren't large, spacious closets, but rather small, basic pieces of furniture that barely held the essentials. When it came to sleeping arrangements, things were even more intimate. Many families shared beds, especially in poorer households. You might have found yourself sleeping alongside your parents or siblings, and maybe even a few cousins or friends. And if you lived in a more crowded area, you might even find yourself sharing your bed with a guest or two. Everyone crammed together under one heavy blanket, trying to catch some sleep amidst the noise, the draft, and the occasional snoring. You couldn't exactly sprawl out and claim your own side of the bed either. There were no sides to a bed in the way we think of them today. Everyone simply squeezed in wherever there was space. The design of these medieval rooms was dictated by necessity, not luxury. Take a moment to think about it. In modern homes, we have entire rooms dedicated to sleeping, guest rooms, master bedrooms, even walk-in closets. But in medieval times, everything was condensed. The space was limited, but that didn't mean people didn't try to make it functional. Beds often served multiple purposes. They were places to sleep, sure, but they also served as seating during the day. After all, there wasn't much else in the room to sit on. Now, let's talk about the idea of privacy, or rather, the complete absence of it. In these cramped rooms, privacy was a foreign concept. There weren't walls or curtains separating different areas. The bed might have been draped with a simple curtain, but that was more for warmth or for keeping out the drafts than for privacy. If you wanted to do anything private, you did it right there, in front of everyone. No quiet, private moments before bed. No time alone with your thoughts. Everything was shared, and privacy didn't exist in the way we think of it today. It's an entirely different world. At night, once everyone had settled into their bed, the room was still a hub of activity. Remember, there was no electrical lighting, so the room would grow pitch dark once the candles went out. It wasn't just the lack of space that made things uncomfortable. It was the sense of being completely surrounded by people, even while you were trying to sleep. It might have been a tight squeeze, but in a way, it was also a little comforting. Everyone was together, in one place, working as a unit to stay warm through the cold nights. And if the room was small, the bed was even smaller. Most medieval beds were simply wooden frames with little more than straw or hay for a mattress. And that mattress wasn't exactly soft. If you were lucky, you'd get a wool or feather mattress, but it was still far from luxurious. The bed itself would have been small, often barely big enough for one person, let alone 2 or 3. People didn't sleep in sprawling king-size beds like we do today. You might have found yourself curled up on a thin mattress, trying to get some sleep between the creaks of the wooden frame and the draft from the cracks in the walls. But despite the cramped conditions, there were some upsides. For one, the bed could provide some warmth, especially if you had a fireplace or a space heater nearby. Medieval people didn't have the luxury of central heating, so the fire was a major source of warmth. People would often sleep near the fire, hoping that the heat would spread enough to make the night bearable. Of course, the fire wasn't always enough. The heat would dissipate quickly in larger rooms, leaving those sleeping near the walls or farthest from the hearth shivering through the night. You've got to hand it to medieval people, though. Despite the lack of comfort, they managed to make it work. Life in these small, tight spaces was simply a part of the day-to-day existence. The challenges of cramped living spaces didn't stop them from carrying on with their lives, often under far harsher conditions than we can even imagine today. In fact, the idea of sleeping in a tiny space with multiple people and animals wasn't seen as strange. It was just part of life. The need for warmth, safety, and a place to sleep was far greater than the need for comfort or personal space. So, when you imagine a medieval bedroom, remember that it wasn't all doom and gloom. While it may seem uncomfortable by modern standards, people found ways to adapt to their surroundings. A small room, a modest bed, and the warmth of family and fire were enough to get through the cold nights. No, it wasn't perfect, but it was home. As you lie there, on that thin mattress surrounded by the chill of the medieval night, it's easy to get lost in the thoughts of how different life must have been in those tight quarters. And believe me, life in medieval bedrooms wasn't all about the cozy warmth of the hearth and the comfort of shared spaces. While a fire could keep you warm, it was far from perfect, and sleeping wasn't exactly easy. The lack of modern amenities like blankets filled with down feathers or memory foam mattresses makes you realize how far we've come. In medieval times, beds were made with whatever materials were readily available, mostly straw, sometimes wool or horsehair. You might have found yourself sleeping on a bed stuffed with straw, which, while somewhat softer than stone, wasn't exactly the plush cushion we enjoy today. The straw would eventually flatten out over time, and though the outer fabric might be mended now and then, it never really provided the kind of comfort we've come to expect. The mattresses would have been tough, uncomfortable, and prone to developing unpleasant smells, especially when they weren't regularly aired out. Imagine lying down after a long day, knowing that your mattress, though filled with straw, still wasn't going to let you sink into the soft luxury of modern sleep. As if that weren't enough, let's talk about the bed frame itself. Most medieval beds were made from simple wood, nothing fancy like the carved oak furniture we see today. The frame would have been sturdy but basic. It wasn't built for luxury or comfort, but rather functionality. After all, you weren't going to be lounging around in the bed all day. You'd be getting up early to work, so comfort wasn't the priority. Now, let's touch on one of the biggest challenges medieval people had to deal with: bed bugs. Yes, the very thing we dread today was a common reality back then. Straw mattresses, which weren't regularly cleaned or replaced, provided an ideal breeding ground for bedbugs and fleas. Sleeping in a medieval bed was more than just uncomfortable. It could be downright infested. Imagine trying to sleep with the constant irritation of biting insects, knowing that your mattress was a haven for them. The lack of hygiene in medieval times was widespread, but the bed was one of the worst offenders. The concept of a clean, fresh-smelling bed was an almost foreign idea. Instead, you'd have to make do with what you had, and that meant dealing with insects, smells, and the overall discomfort of your sleeping situation. Still, despite these challenges, the bed was a significant part of medieval life. For one thing, it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was also a place where people would spend a lot of their time during the day. Since the medieval day began at dawn and ended long after sunset, the bed became a multifunctional space. People didn't just sleep in their beds, they would often eat their meals in them, especially if they were ill or elderly. If you were lucky enough to have a slightly larger bed, it could also serve as a space for other activities like sewing or reading. Of course, you weren't going to be lounging around in a luxurious silk robe while doing these things. The bed was a practical place where you worked, ate, and rested, all in one cramped space. This brings us to the larger social context of medieval living. As we've already seen, privacy wasn't really a thing. People lived in close quarters with their families, sometimes their animals, and possibly even guests. Sharing a bed was not unusual. In fact, families often slept together in one large bed for warmth and protection. Imagine this. Multiple people, piled together in one bed, each trying to find a spot on the thin, flat mattress. But it wasn't just about warmth. For medieval people, it was a matter of safety. With the frequent threats of bandits, wild animals, and even plagues, the family bed was a protective measure that kept everyone close and safe. The warmth from bodies huddled together was necessary for survival, especially during the bitter cold months. If you had a larger bed, you might have been more fortunate, but not by much. Even the wealthiest households didn't have sprawling, luxurious beds by today's standards. The rich, of course, had bigger beds, often covered in finer linens or rich tapestries, but the overall layout of the room remained cramped. You could expect your bed to be positioned near the hearth, where the heat would help keep you warm, though it also meant dealing with the smoke and ash that came with it. A four-poster bed might have had curtains, which could keep out the cold at night, but they also trapped smoke in the room, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. The wealthier classes might have also had a bedchamber, a room meant solely for sleeping, though it still wasn't spacious. For them, the bed was a status symbol, a place to showcase fine linens and decorative curtains. But even in these rooms, space was tight, and personal comfort remained a relative concept. Luxury in medieval times was quite different from what we think of today. A rich bed might have been larger, but it still wouldn't have provided the sprawling comfort you enjoy in your own home. People didn't have massive king-sized beds with endless room to stretch out. The most they could hope for was a slightly larger bed with better bedding, but still nothing like the sprawling beds we take for granted. At the end of the day, the medieval bed was as much about survival and function as it was about comfort. It was a place to sleep, eat, and even work all rolled into one. It provided warmth, safety, and a place to retreat from the dangers of the world outside. But don't mistake that for luxury. Luxury was a concept far removed from the reality of the medieval bedroom. The bed was just one part of a much larger, often uncomfortable living situation, but it was the closest thing to a sanctuary people had. Despite all the discomforts, it was home. Now, as the night stretches on and you're still lying there in that medieval bed, you may start to wonder about how these people survived without the comforts we take for granted today. How did they manage to sleep or even function in these cramped and uncomfortable conditions? Well, part of the answer lies in the way medieval homes and bedrooms were designed to combat the cold and make the most of limited space. The warmth of the fire was essential, but it wasn't a miracle worker. Sure, a roaring fire in the hearth could heat the room a little, but that warmth didn't travel far. The bed was often placed as close to the hearth as possible, but even then, the fire's heat would be strongest at the center of the room, leaving the corners and outer edges colder. And that's where the thick blankets came in. People piled on layer after layer of heavy woolen blankets to trap the heat, but even those didn't always provide enough warmth on freezing nights. Imagine how the room must have felt, even with the fire burning. The heat from the hearth would be a welcome relief after a long day, but it wouldn't stop the cold from creeping in through the gaps in the stone walls. And those walls, while sturdy, did little to keep out the draft. Medieval houses were built with practicality in mind, not comfort. The stone walls may have been strong and thick, but they weren't insulated. Any warmth generated by the fire would quickly dissipate, and soon enough, the air would grow cold again. To combat this, medieval people used anything they could to fill in the gaps: straw, cloth, and sometimes even mud. You might think that the fire was enough to keep the room warm throughout the night, but that's where medieval heating methods start to show their limitations. The fire needed constant tending, and when it burned low, the room would cool down rapidly. It wasn't unusual for people to wake up in the middle of the night, shivering from the cold, only to have to stoke the fire back to life. So even in the comfort of your shared bed, the night could feel long and cold, especially in winter. And while we're on the subject of cold, let's talk about the medieval winter. Picture this. You're bundled up in layers of wool and fur, huddled with family or friends beneath several blankets, trying to keep warm. The room around you is dark except for the flickering shadows cast by the fire. The night feels endless, and sleep comes slowly, if at all. The cold that you feel inside the house isn't just physical. It's a constant reminder of the dangers outside. Without modern conveniences, every day in winter was a battle against the elements. The fire was your ally, but it could only do so much. And while the cold was one challenge, the dampness was another. Medieval homes, especially those built in rural areas, were prone to dampness. The materials used to build the homes, stone, wood, thatch, were not great at keeping moisture out. The floors were often made of packed dirt, which didn't help with insulation either. So not only were you dealing with the cold, but the air itself felt heavy with moisture. The dampness could seep into your clothes, your bedding, and even your bones. In fact, historians argue that this constant dampness might have contributed to the health issues people suffered during this time. Rheumatism, joint pain, and colds were common, and the constant exposure to cold and damp likely took a toll on people's physical well-being. Now, imagine that your bed is where you spend the most time. In medieval homes, people didn't just sleep in their beds. They often ate, socialized, and sometimes worked there too. The bed was often a multifunctional piece of furniture, and this meant that the space around it was quite limited. People didn't have large dining tables or separate sitting areas, so everything happened in the same cramped space. It wasn't unusual for people to eat their meals while sitting on their beds, balancing bowls of soup or chunks of bread on their laps. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a central part of daily life. But perhaps the most fascinating thing about these medieval bedrooms is the way they were designed for warmth. The heavy wool blankets, the layers of clothing, the proximity to the fire, they were all part of a system designed to survive. Sleeping in a medieval bed wasn't about luxury or comfort. It was about endurance. People didn't have the luxury of sleeping in a warm, perfectly insulated room with soft sheets and a comfy mattress. Instead, they had to make do with what they had. They had to get creative with their bedding, their fire, and their space in order to stay warm through long, cold nights. Now, we've already discussed the bed itself and how it was used as a multifunctional piece of furniture. But there's more to the story. The bed was often the center of activity, not just for sleeping, but for the whole family. When you lived in a small, cramped room, you made use of every inch of space. So the bed became more than just a place to sleep. It was a place to gather, to eat, to work, and sometimes even to entertain. And when you had guests over, the bed became a communal space where everyone could relax and share a conversation. This wasn't about luxury, it was about making the best of your situation. But for all the practicality of these medieval bedrooms, it's hard to ignore the sense of claustrophobia that must have been a constant presence. The lack of space, the uncomfortable beds, the lack of privacy. It all added up to a lifestyle that was far from easy. But for the people who lived in these conditions, this was their reality. The medieval bedroom, though cramped and uncomfortable, was a place of survival, a place where people gathered together to stay warm and secure, and a place where life went on despite the harsh conditions. As the night wears on in your medieval bedroom, you might start to feel the weight of it all. The tightness, the lack of space, the layers of blankets that don't quite seem to keep you warm enough. But there's something more here, something that gets to the heart of the medieval bedroom. The bed itself was more than just a place for sleeping. In fact, it was the very centerpiece of the room, and its design and purpose were driven by much more than just practicality. The medieval bed was, in many ways, a symbol of status, of identity, and of survival. Let's take a closer look at how beds functioned beyond the simple act of sleeping. To start, imagine you're in a larger medieval household, one of the wealthier families. You're not lying in a cramped, shared space with 5 other people, but you're still not living in the lap of luxury as we think of it today. Your bed would be a little more comfortable than the straw-filled mattresses of the lower classes, but the size would still be surprisingly modest. Even the nobility often slept in smaller, simple wooden beds, though theirs were adorned with fine fabrics and plush bedding. The idea of luxury in medieval times wasn't about size or space. It was about materials and appearance. But even in wealthier households, the bed was still a practical piece of furniture. During the day, the bed often served as a seat. In a room where space was at a premium, it didn't make sense to have separate chairs or sofas. Instead, the bed was used for multiple purposes. You ate your meals there, worked there, and sometimes even entertained guests there. It was the focal point of the room. The wealthy might have had a few more personal items scattered around, perhaps a mirror, some furniture, but the bed was always the center of attention. The idea of personal space didn't exist in the way we think of it today. The bed wasn't just a private retreat. It was a shared space that could be used for multiple activities. Now, if you were among the poorest of the poor, things were even more stark. You might not have had a separate room for sleeping, and your bed would have been little more than a straw-filled sack or some woolen cloth tossed on the floor. In these conditions, it wasn't just about lack of space, it was about a lack of options. Your bed, if you had one, was often placed wherever there was room, and that space was often limited. It wasn't unusual for several members of the family to sleep together in a shared bed, crammed in next to each other for warmth and security. You might have noticed that throughout history, the idea of privacy and personal space has been inextricably linked to one's social class. The wealthy had more space, more room to spread out, while the lower classes were forced into cramped, uncomfortable spaces where privacy was practically non-existent. This division of space was more than just a reflection of wealth, it was a reflection of power, of status, and of how medieval society functioned. And this brings us to another interesting aspect of medieval bedroom design: the role of the bed in religion. Yes, religion. Religion in medieval times was deeply ingrained in everyday life, and it influenced even the design of the bedroom. The religious significance of the bed was reflected in its use, as well as in the rituals surrounding sleep. In fact, many medieval people believed that the bed was a sacred space, one where they could connect with God. Before going to sleep, it wasn't uncommon to say prayers or blessings. And in some households, the bed was a place where children were baptized or where the dying received their final rites. But it wasn't just the religious aspect of the bed that made it special. It was also seen as a place of protection. Medieval people believed that the bed, especially the canopy or curtains around the bed, could serve as a barrier to evil spirits. The bed wasn't just a physical space for sleeping. It was a symbolic space for safety and protection, a place to ward off danger. The belief in the protective power of the bed was so strong that some people even placed religious symbols or charms under their mattresses, hoping to protect themselves from illness or bad luck. You can imagine, then, how important the bed was in the medieval household. For the rich, it was a symbol of wealth and status, but for the poor, it was a necessity for survival. Even for the most destitute, the bed was the one piece of furniture that could provide warmth, comfort, and a sense of security. But for all its symbolism, it was still a practical object used for more than just sleeping. It was where families ate, worked, and spent much of their time together. It was a multifunctional space, one that couldn't afford to be wasted. But despite all the multitasking, it's hard to ignore how small these beds were. Even if you were among the wealthier classes, space was still limited. The size of the bed was dictated by practicality. You slept in a bed, sure, but that bed had to fit in the room, and the room had to fit in the house. And those houses weren't always spacious. Even in the homes of the rich, bedrooms were often small. While you might have a larger bed, the room itself would still be cramped. The size of the bed wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to get you through the night. After all, you weren't going to be lounging around all day in your bed. You had work to do, whether that was tending to the animals, managing your estate, or, for the poor, working in the fields. So, as you lie there in your medieval bed, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the weight of the blankets, take a moment to appreciate the way this humble piece of furniture shaped the way people lived, slept, and worked. It wasn't just a place to rest. It was a symbol of survival, a place where the physical and spiritual needs of the individual and the family intersected. The medieval bed, for all its discomfort, provided more than just sleep. It was a place where people found warmth, protection, and a sense of closeness to their loved ones. It wasn't the most comfortable bed by today's standards, but for the medieval world, it was all they had, and it got them through the long, cold nights. As you settle further into the quiet of the medieval night, it's hard to ignore just how important the bed became in the daily rhythms of life. While it's tempting to focus on the discomfort, the lack of space, the scratchy wool, the cold that never quite goes away, the bed itself was an indispensable part of medieval existence. In fact, it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a vital part of family life, social interactions, and even survival. Let's take a deeper look at how these shared spaces functioned. In a typical medieval home, the bedroom wasn't just a space for rest. It was the center of family life. Think about it. The bed was a multi-purpose piece of furniture. It wasn't just used for sleeping. It was often the place where families ate, worked, and gathered together. Especially in smaller homes, the bed was the focal point of the room, where everyone would meet to spend time together. But even more fascinating is the way this shared bed functioned as the true center of warmth, comfort, and survival. Let's say you had a family of 4 or 5. Imagine that your entire family is gathered around this single bed, huddled under a pile of wool blankets, trying to keep warm in the dead of winter. There's no personal space, no privacy to speak of. But in a way, the intimacy of this arrangement created a sense of unity. The shared warmth and closeness became a necessity for survival. If you were living in a particularly cold climate, having multiple bodies in one bed helped to maintain heat, something that would have been crucial to surviving the harsh winters. Now, in wealthier households, things might have been a little different. The noble classes had the luxury of larger beds and slightly more space. However, even their arrangements weren't without their peculiarities. While they may have had better bedding, perhaps filled with down feathers or fine wool, they still lived in relatively small spaces. These beds were placed near the hearth, often in the center of a room, and would have been used for more than just sleeping. A bed in a noble's home wasn't just a place to rest. It was often used for eating, talking, or receiving guests. As we mentioned earlier, there wasn't much distinction between spaces for sleeping and spaces for living. Even for the wealthy, beds weren't meant to be a retreat. They were more like a utility, a place where the family could gather in relative warmth. But it wasn't just about the physical closeness. The medieval bed had social implications as well. For one thing, the bed was a space where personal privacy was virtually non-existent. In poorer households, it was normal for entire families to share a single bed, as we've seen. But even in wealthier homes, the concept of privacy was often blurred. You might have guests visiting your home, and if the bed was big enough, they might stay there with you right under the same roof. This shared intimacy wasn't necessarily a negative thing, but it was a reflection of the smaller, more communal nature of life during that time. There was no such thing as a guest room or a private space to retreat to. Your bed was, quite literally, shared with anyone who needed a place to sleep. Another fascinating aspect of medieval beds, and one that would make modern minds recoil, is the lack of hygiene. The medieval period was not known for its cleanliness, and the bed was one of the places where that fact was most obvious. Imagine a world without modern sanitation. No running water, no showers. Your bed was where you spent a third of your life, but it was also where dirt, sweat, and bodily fluids accumulated. For the wealthy, there were occasional washings of the bed linens, but these weren't frequent. And for the poor, well, they probably weren't washing their blankets and mattresses at all. This wasn't exactly the clean, fresh-smelling environment we'd expect in modern bedrooms. And while the warmth of the body kept you snug, it didn't necessarily keep you clean. Medieval people also had a somewhat different view of cleanliness compared to what we're used to today. Bathing wasn't a daily ritual for most people. Far from it. The idea of bathing was somewhat taboo in certain periods of the Middle Ages, and many people feared that too much bathing could actually harm the body. So instead, they relied on simpler methods to keep themselves clean, like using herbs and oils to mask body odor. The same approach to cleanliness extended to the bed. Rather than washing everything regularly, medieval people would often rely on the smell of smoke from the fire or the fragrance of herbs placed in the mattress or around the bed to cover up the unpleasant smells. For the wealthy, however, bed cleanliness and comfort were more important, though still not to the standards we're used to today. They might have had servants who were responsible for cleaning the sheets and replacing the bedding. In noble households, the bed was often draped in fine fabrics, and mattresses were filled with the finest available materials, sometimes even feathers. These beds might have had decorative canopies, curtains, or tapestries hung around them. These decorations not only served to enhance the bed's status but also helped to keep out drafts and insects, adding a touch of privacy where it was needed. However, even the richest families still dealt with the issue of space. In castles and large homes, the layout of rooms was often cramped, with multiple people occupying a single space. The bed remained the focal point, and no matter how much wealth you had, the reality was that you still had to make do with the space you had. The larger bed in the noble household didn't necessarily mean a better quality of life. It simply meant a slightly bigger bed and nicer bedding. What's fascinating here is how the medieval bed, despite its lack of comfort by modern standards, became a symbol of survival. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was a sanctuary of warmth in a world that was often dark, cold, and harsh. In these shared spaces, where intimacy and practicality converged, people learned to live together, make do with what they had, and adapt to the conditions of their environment. It's this adaptability, this focus on function over comfort, that defines the medieval approach to life, and the bed is a perfect example of that. Now, as you drift off in your imagined medieval bed, think about the people who lived in these conditions. Their lives were undoubtedly hard, but they were also resilient. The bed, that simple, humble object, helped them survive, connect with others, and, in its own way, thrive. It wasn't about luxury. It was about warmth, safety, and survival in a world that demanded far more than comfort. As the flicker of the hearth's dying embers casts long shadows across the room, you might begin to feel the rhythmic nature of medieval life, where every moment was woven into the very fabric of survival, intimacy, and practicality. The bed, despite its cramped nature, was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a living, breathing part of the daily routine, a symbol of the interconnectedness of every aspect of life. But the question remains, how did people manage to live, work, and sleep in such small, often uncomfortable spaces? One of the most striking things about medieval bedrooms was their adaptability. These small, functional spaces weren't designed for relaxation in the way we think of today. There were no luxurious memory foam mattresses, no soft sheets that hugged your body as you sank into a peaceful sleep. Instead, people adapted to their environment, using the bed as a tool for survival and a place to huddle together against the harshness of the outside world. When you woke up in your medieval bed, there were no bright, cheerful rays of sunlight streaming in through your windows. The medieval world was darker, colder, and quieter than the modern world, and people had to adjust to those realities. When the sun set, it really set. Without electricity, there was no artificial light to keep the night at bay. The only light would come from the flickering fire or from candles, and even those had their limits. Nightfall was not a time for activity. It was a time for sleep and rest, for huddling together in the warmth of the fire and beneath the heavy blankets. That sense of huddling, of communal warmth, was one of the most important aspects of medieval life. It wasn't just the cold outside that made the bed such a communal space. It was the very nature of medieval society. People didn't live alone in their rooms. Families, friends, even neighbors would often share these cramped spaces, all nestled together to keep warm during the cold months. The small medieval room wasn't just a place for sleep. It was a place for connection, for closeness, and for survival. Imagine lying there, drifting in and out of sleep as the fire flickers and the room is enveloped in the heavy stillness of the night. The warmth from the bodies around you, the soft rustle of wool blankets, and the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. All of this creates a cocoon of sorts, a comforting space that keeps the cold and the darkness at bay. And while you may not have the privacy or comfort we associate with sleep today, there is something undeniably peaceful about being so close to those you care about. Life in these small spaces wasn't easy, but it brought people together in ways we've long since lost in our modern, sprawling homes. But while this communal warmth and shared space was essential to surviving the medieval winter, it wasn't without its downsides. The close quarters meant that personal space was virtually non-existent. In modern homes, we treasure our bedrooms as personal retreats, places where we can escape from the outside world. Not so in medieval times. If you needed to talk, if you needed to rest, or even if you simply needed a moment of quiet, you didn't have the luxury of retreating to your own private corner. Instead, everything work, meals, leisure happened in the same shared space. The bed itself, despite its lack of comfort, became a place for multiple purposes, which only further highlights the lack of privacy. You would likely have eaten your meals in this bed, especially if you were ill, elderly, or too tired to sit at a table. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was the only place to rest during the day, a place where people gathered to socialize, work, and sometimes even read or write. It wasn't uncommon to see a medieval person reading or writing by candlelight, propped up on their bed in the middle of the room. And while we might think of this as uncomfortable or inefficient, for medieval people it was a reality they had to adapt to. The idea of rest in these spaces also differed significantly from how we think of rest today. Without the distractions of modern technology, there wasn't much to do in the bedroom except sleep, eat, or socialize. But don't mistake this for a lack of activity. The medieval world was filled with physical labor, and the bedroom often became a place of recuperation from those long, tiring days. The bed provided a temporary respite, a place to recover before the cycle of work began again. Even the idea of sleep itself was different. In the medieval period, people didn't sleep through the entire night in one go. The practice of segmented sleep was common, where people would sleep for a few hours, wake up for a while in the middle of the night, and then return to sleep until morning. During that wakeful period, people might pray, read, or even visit neighbors. This fragmented sleep schedule, while unfamiliar to us, was perfectly natural for the medieval person, and it was essential for maintaining a balance between work, rest, and the need for warmth and safety. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of medieval life was the sense of unity that these shared spaces fostered. People didn't just sleep next to each other. They lived together in every sense of the word. Your bed, the room, and the space around you were shared with family, friends, and sometimes strangers. It was an existence built on cooperation, on survival. And though the conditions may have been uncomfortable, it was a life built around warmth, both physical and emotional. As the fire in the hearth burns low, casting one final flicker of light across the room, you start to drift off, surrounded by the presence of your loved ones. The cold night outside seems so distant now. Here, in your shared space, you are safe, you are warm, and for tonight, at least, you are at peace. The medieval bed, for all its discomforts, was a place where people found comfort, connection, and a sense of belonging, even amidst the most difficult circumstances. As the silence of the room settles around you, and the fire in the hearth is reduced to glowing embers, you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down on you. The medieval bed, for all its discomforts, was an intimate space where people rested, but also where life unfolded in ways we would never imagine today. The idea of privacy was almost entirely absent, and the bed was just one of many shared spaces in medieval homes. And while the bed itself may have been uncomfortable, it was essential to the survival of the people who used it, offering warmth, rest, and a sense of security during the long, cold nights. But beyond just being a place to sleep, the bed played a significant role in the daily rhythms of medieval life. It was used for everything, from eating to working to entertaining guests. The medieval bed wasn't simply a piece of furniture. It was the center of life, a place where people gathered to share not just warmth, but also conversation, food, and affection. It wasn't about luxury, it was about making do with what you had. But in this making do, people forged bonds with each other and adapted to the harsh realities of their environment. And yet, when we think about the medieval period, we often imagine grand castles and sprawling estates. But the reality for most people was much more humble. The majority of medieval people lived in small homes, often with just 1 or 2 rooms. The idea of multiple bedrooms or large living spaces was foreign to most. In fact, many families would have slept in the same room, sometimes even the same bed. It wasn't unusual for people to share their space not just with their family, but with animals as well, especially in rural homes. Cows, pigs, and chickens were often kept indoors to protect them from the cold, and in some cases, they slept right alongside their owners. This shared space wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival, about making sure that everyone and everything had a place to sleep, and that the warmth of the fire could be shared by as many people as possible. The lack of privacy in medieval homes is something that's often hard to grasp in the modern world. We've grown used to the luxury of personal space, where we can retreat to our own rooms, away from the prying eyes of others. But for medieval people, privacy simply wasn't a part of daily life. Even in wealthier households, where people had more space, privacy was still limited. There were no locked doors, no personal bedrooms where you could escape from the world. Instead, everyone lived in close quarters, sharing not just space, but their lives. It was a way of life that emphasized connection, community, and survival. And while modern minds might recoil at the idea of sharing a bed with several people or even animals, for medieval people it was a necessity. The communal nature of medieval living was essential to survival in a time when resources were limited and safety was never guaranteed. The bed, humble as it may have been, was the center of this communal life. It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a place where people connected, rested, and shared what little they had. The cold, the darkness, and the discomfort were all part of the experience, but they also created a sense of togetherness and shared resilience. The medieval bed, in its own way, was a symbol of the strength of human connection in the face of hardship. Now, let's take a moment to think about the practical aspects of medieval living. When you look at your own comfortable bed and bedroom, it's easy to forget how much has changed. We have modern conveniences like central heating, thick mattresses, and soft sheets that make sleep a much more pleasant experience. But in medieval times, people didn't have those luxuries. Instead, they relied on the warmth of their bodies, the fire, and the layers of clothing and blankets to keep them warm. The bed was never just about comfort. It was about survival. People didn't sleep to rest. They slept to endure, to prepare for another day of hard work, of harsh conditions, and of constant struggle. This focus on survival was reflected in every aspect of medieval life. Food was scarce, hygiene was limited, and safety was never guaranteed. The small, simple bed was one of the few constants in a world filled with uncertainty. It was a place where you could rest your weary body after a long day, where you could escape, however briefly, from the harsh realities of life. And in a world where everything was transient and fleeting, the bed became a symbol of the endurance of the human spirit, a place where people came together to rest, recover, and prepare for the challenges of the next day. But even in this simplicity, there was a beauty to be found. The shared space, the communal warmth, the sense of connection, all of these things were essential to the way people lived. And while we might look back on the medieval bedroom with discomfort, there's something humbling about the way people adapted to their circumstances. They didn't have the comforts we enjoy today, but they made do with what they had. They found warmth in each other's company, solace in the shared space, and strength in the simple act of survival. As you lie there in your medieval bed, the fire now reduced to glowing embers, you begin to drift off, your mind at ease despite the discomfort of the room. The space around you, cramped and dimly lit, feels strangely comforting. You are not alone. The warmth of your family, your loved ones, and your community surrounds you. And in this small, humble bed, you find rest, not just for your body, but for your spirit. As the night deepens and you settle deeper into your imagined medieval bed, the air feels thick with the quiet hum of centuries past. The fire has dwindled to just a faint glow, casting soft shadows that stretch across the stone walls. For all the discomfort and cold, the shared warmth of the room provides some comfort. But beneath the surface of this humble, tight space, there's something profoundly interesting about how the bed itself served a unique role in the medieval home. In addition to the basic functions of providing a place to sleep, the medieval bed had a symbolic function. It wasn't just a spot for rest. It was a stage for important moments in the lives of medieval people. It was the space where births, deaths, marriages, and the everyday rituals of life played out. From childbirth to the dying breaths of the elderly, the bed was where people spent much of their time, and in some ways, it became a kind of anchor for life's most significant moments. But the symbolism of the bed didn't end with life events. It was also a representation of a person's place in the social hierarchy. In medieval society, your bed was one of the few personal possessions that reflected your status. For the nobility, the bed was often elaborate, with fine linens, canopies, and richly decorated frames. These beds were meant to display wealth, power, and influence. You can imagine a noble family's bedroom, large, with a canopy bed draped in rich fabrics, possibly even embroidered with coats of arms or family symbols. But, for the most part, this symbolism wasn't about comfort, it was about display. The purpose of these luxurious beds wasn't to provide restful sleep, but to show off wealth and power to guests. However, for the common people, the bed was a far humbler affair. Often a simple wooden frame with a thin mattress of straw or hay. It didn't symbolize luxury. It symbolized survival. For the peasantry, the bed was far more utilitarian. But despite its lack of elegance, the medieval bed played an essential role in maintaining family life. It was a space for intimate moments, a shared place of rest, and an area where people could connect, eat, or simply take refuge from the world outside. Now, think back to those chilly medieval nights. The cold was an ever-present companion, and the room you're in isn't much warmer than the air outside. The fire might offer a little heat, but it's no match for the brutal winters. So, what did people do to survive these cold nights? They used every trick they could think of. In wealthier households, heavy curtains or tapestries might have been used to keep the heat from escaping the bed's vicinity. In poorer homes, the only barrier between them and the cold might have been a few layers of woolen blankets, which, despite being thick, didn't offer the kind of insulation we take for granted today. And don't forget that the bed itself wasn't just for sleeping. It was used to gather heat from others. People would huddle close to each other for warmth, and often, entire families or even multiple families would sleep in one bed, each person trying to stay warm amidst the cold. But the bed was also a place of intimacy, not just warmth in the literal sense, but warmth in terms of connection. People often spent much of their time in bed together, whether for conversation, rest, or even work. Meals were sometimes eaten in the bed, especially if the person was too ill or elderly to sit at the table. In this sense, the bed became a place where bonds were forged and strengthened. It wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was an essential part of medieval life, a place where people shared everything from their warmth to their stories, from their meals to their most personal moments. But there's something else about the medieval bed that we have to consider: the hygiene. As we've mentioned before, personal hygiene in medieval times was nowhere near what we're used to today. Modern conveniences like running water, soap, and frequent bathing were unheard of, and even the wealthier classes didn't bathe as often as we might expect. The lack of regular washing meant that the bed, especially the mattress, was not exactly a clean environment. Over time, mattresses filled with straw would accumulate dust, sweat, and dirt, making them prone to unpleasant odors. And let's not forget the bedbugs and fleas that thrived in these less than ideal conditions. Sleeping in the medieval bed wasn't just uncomfortable, it could also be a bit unsanitary. But for medieval people, this was simply a part of life. There were no modern cleaning products to sanitize the bed or the room. The idea of cleanliness was more about covering up smells than eliminating germs. Freshness came in the form of herbs, flowers, and sometimes even perfume, but it was a far cry from the sparkling clean beds we enjoy today. This brings us to the significance of the communal aspect of the medieval bed. We've talked about how people slept together in cramped, shared spaces for warmth and survival, but there's also something to be said about the social aspect of this arrangement. In a world where privacy was rare, and personal space even rarer, the bed served as a social hub. It wasn't uncommon for people to entertain guests in their bedrooms, and often, families would use the bed to spend time together, even if they were just resting or talking. This level of closeness fostered a sense of community that was essential to life in the medieval world. The family bed wasn't just about physical survival. It was about maintaining social bonds, sharing stories, and supporting each other emotionally in a time when the world outside could be harsh and unpredictable. The bed, in all its discomfort, was a space of connection. It was a place where people gathered together, where life happened, and where memories were made. Whether it was a noble's grand four-poster bed or a peasant's humble straw mattress, it was an integral part of the medieval home. And while we might cringe at the idea of such close quarters, there's something beautifully human about how these shared spaces helped people survive and thrive together. The medieval bed, though humble, became a symbol of endurance, of connection, and of the importance of human togetherness in a world that was far less certain than the one we live in today. As you drift off into the quiet of the night, imagine the long, slow rhythms of medieval life. The shared spaces, the communal warmth, and the constant drive to endure. The bed might not have been a perfect sanctuary, but it was home warm, cramped, and filled with the quiet hum of life. The stillness of the room deepens, and as you lie there, the medieval bed begins to feel almost like a strange time capsule. A small, intimate space that holds within it the stories of countless lives, each one shaped by the cold and the warmth, the shared blankets, and the confined quarters. The fire has almost burned out, leaving a faint glow that flickers across the stone walls. As you close your eyes and settle into this quiet, you might start to notice how much the medieval bed was more than just a place to sleep. It was a place for conversation, work, and survival, whether you were a noble or a peasant. When it comes to the lower classes, life was much more basic and space was at a premium. You were not just sharing the bed with family members, but also with animals and sometimes with guests. In the medieval period, communal living was the norm. If you lived in a rural area, you could expect the presence of farm animals inside your house, especially during the winter months. The warmth from the animals, particularly livestock like cows, was a natural source of heat. But this also meant that the bed, already cramped, would have to accommodate even more bodies, whether animal or human. Imagine trying to sleep in a room shared with chickens, goats, and the occasional pig, all clustered around the hearth to keep warm. The smell, the sounds, and the rustling of the animals would be an integral part of your nightly routine. For the poorest, the bed wasn't just for sleeping. It was their primary piece of furniture, a space to eat, to relax, to socialize. It wasn't uncommon for families to gather in the bed throughout the day. There weren't large tables for meals. Instead, they ate on the bed, sitting cross-legged or reclining as best they could. The bed, humble as it was, had to serve more than one purpose. It was a meeting place, a resting space, and a refuge from the cold all at once. In some ways, it was the heart of the home. It was where conversations happened, where stories were told, and where connections were made, even in the most uncomfortable conditions. For those living in more urban areas, the living conditions weren't much better. Medieval homes, especially in cities, were often tiny, with multiple families living in a single room. These rooms, packed with people, animals, and their meager possessions, were used for everything. The bed wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a multipurpose space that had to serve the needs of an entire family, sometimes even a community. Guests would often sleep in the same room, and there was little regard for personal space. In fact, in many cases, there wasn't much private life to be had. But for all the discomforts, there was also something profoundly human about this arrangement. The shared space, the absence of privacy, meant that people were constantly in each other's lives. If you were cold at night, your family members were there beside you, providing warmth. If you were hungry, you could share a meal together in the same bed. If you were sad or ill, you would find solace in the presence of your loved ones. The bed wasn't just for sleeping. It was where life happened, in all its messiness, its intimacy, and its survival. And then, of course, there were the nights when things went wrong. Medieval people didn't have the luxuries we enjoy today, such as comfortable mattresses or thick blankets to shield them from the cold. Instead, they had to make do with what they had, which often wasn't much. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, the cold creeping through your thin blankets, the fire having burned low. You would have to get up, stoke the fire, and do whatever it took to make it through the night. The medieval bed wasn't just a place of rest. It was a place of constant vigilance, where you had to be aware of your surroundings, whether it was the cold or the potential danger of the outside world. But there were also moments of quiet joy. The medieval world was harsh, and the bed provided a rare sanctuary in a world full of uncertainty. It wasn't luxurious, but it offered a kind of connection that we sometimes take for granted today. In that small, shared space, people came together to sleep, to share stories, to keep warm, and to find comfort in each other's presence. It wasn't just a place to rest. It was a place where life's most important moments unfolded, often in the most unassuming way. And while the medieval bed may not have been the picture of comfort, it played a pivotal role in the larger picture of medieval life. It was a symbol of endurance, a humble testament to the resilience of people living in a world that was, at times, unforgiving. In many ways, the bed was a microcosm of the larger medieval experience, intimate, close-knit, and designed for survival. There were no lavish comforts, no indulgences, and certainly no space to spread out. But in those small, shared spaces, people found ways to make it work, to endure, and to find comfort, even in the most challenging of circumstances. As you lie there in the medieval bed, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the night, take a moment to appreciate the strength that it represents. The bed, small and uncomfortable, was a place of unity and survival. It was where people huddled together to face the challenges of the world, where bonds were formed, and where comfort was found in the warmth of others. In this simple, humble space, life carried on, not always easy, but always enduring. And as the fire dies down completely, you drift off into sleep, knowing that in the medieval world, sleep was more than just rest. It was a part of a larger, shared existence. The gentle warmth from the slowly fading fire provides the last bit of comfort for the night. You lie still in the dim room, where the soft rustling of wool blankets is the only sound. It's a far cry from the soft comfort of modern bedding, but there's a certain charm in this simplicity, in the way medieval people found a sense of peace despite such tight, uncomfortable quarters. The medieval bed was a constant, always there, providing warmth and comfort in whatever form it could, whether surrounded by family, animals, or guests. However, this serenity was only one side of the story. The challenges of sleeping in the medieval world were not just physical but psychological. The absence of personal space was a constant source of strain. In the modern world, the idea of having your own room, your own bed, feels essential to your sense of identity and rest. But in medieval times, the lines between public and private were blurred, especially when it came to the space where you slept. Families lived in close proximity to one another, and privacy wasn't just scarce, it was nearly non-existent. The medieval bed, more often than not, was shared with multiple people, and that lack of privacy meant that everything from sleep to personal habits became communal. And then there was the issue of the night itself. Without the luxury of electric lighting, nightfall marked an immediate shift in life. It was quiet and dark, but also a bit unnerving. The cold, the dampness in the air, the unfamiliar sounds of creaking wood, and the crackling of the fire were constant reminders of the world outside. You had no way of knowing who might be walking by, what animals were lurking nearby, or what dangers the night might bring. These long hours lying in bed were sometimes filled with restlessness, not just due to physical discomfort, but because of the sheer uncertainty of the world around you. If you lived in a rural home, the risk of danger from wild animals was always looming. Though most medieval people would have slept with the door shut and perhaps a lock or two, security in those days was often flimsy. A loud noise in the night might have been a sign of an animal trying to get into the house, or it could have been the sound of someone trying to break in. The peace of sleep, so precious to us today, was a fragile thing in the medieval world. People relied on the warmth of their family and the safety of the walls around them, but there was always the knowledge that external forces, whether nature or human, could disrupt that safety at any time. And while the cold nights and possible threats might have caused anxiety, the medieval bed was also a place of resilience. Despite the discomfort, despite the smallness, this bed provided a space where people could come together and share what little warmth they could. When you're huddled close to others, body to body, the physical closeness creates a sense of emotional security. You may not have had your own private corner to retreat to, but you had the comforting presence of the people around you, all united in the shared goal of surviving the night. In the medieval world, everything was communal. Even sleeping was a shared experience, a reminder of the interconnectedness of family and community. The bed was never just a place to sleep. It was a space where people lived, shared, and sometimes worked. Whether it was used to gather around the hearth, to entertain guests, or to simply stay warm, the bed served as the foundation for much of life's daily interactions. But despite all the trials that came with medieval life, there was a certain resilience to it all. People knew what they had to do to survive. Whether it was making do with uncomfortable bedding, coping with the cold, or adjusting to the shared spaces, they adapted in ways that allowed them to continue, to endure, and even to find joy in the small moments of connection. The bed, despite being a symbol of discomfort, was also a symbol of endurance, a space where life continued, even when times were hard. The medieval bed was more than just a piece of furniture. It was a testament to human resilience and connection, a small, humble space where people could rest, come together, and face the challenges of the world. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't luxurious, but for the people who used it, it was enough. It was a place to find rest, warmth, and safety, in a world that offered little of either. And as you settle into your imagined medieval bed, you can't help but feel the weight of that resilience. The resilience of the people who lived in those small, crowded rooms, finding warmth and comfort in the simplest of things. The medieval bed, small and uncomfortable as it may seem, was a microcosm of medieval life itself. It was a world where comfort was hard to come by, but warmth, love, and connection were found in abundance. It was a place where people could rest, not just their bodies, but their spirits, in the company of those they cared about most. And though we might look back on it with a sense of discomfort, there's something profoundly human about the way people made it work, about the way they adapted to their environment, forged connections, and survived together, all while making the best of their humble circumstances. As the night grows even quieter and the last embers of the fire flicker out, the medieval world around you falls silent. You too slowly drift off to sleep in your shared bed. Though it's not a place of luxury or comfort, it's a place of community, of warmth, and of endurance. In this small, humble space, you rest, together with those around you, ready to face whatever the new day might bring. The fire has long since faded to embers, and the room is now blanketed in darkness. The cold, while ever present, is softened by the collective warmth of those around you. The medieval bed, though cramped and uncomfortable, provides the one source of solace during these long, tiring nights. As you lie there, drifting off to sleep, the quiet of the room settles in, and you can almost feel the centuries of history wrapped up in this very moment. You've come a long way from the comforts of modern life, and yet, there's something deeply soothing about the simplicity of this medieval bed. The closeness of family, the quiet sounds of the night, and the gentle pressure of the blankets are a reminder that, despite all the challenges, life in the medieval period had its own rhythm. It wasn't about the luxury of sleep or the privacy of space. It was about enduring, about coming together in the face of hardship. The medieval bed wasn't simply a place to sleep. It was a reflection of the communal nature of life. Whether in the small homes of peasants or the grand castles of the nobility, the bed was central to daily life. It served as a place of connection, of sharing, and of survival. In the absence of modern comforts, the bed became the one constant where people could find warmth and rest, even if only for a few hours. The bed wasn't perfect, but it was enough. It provided the space for rest and recovery, for intimacy and connection, and for the survival of those who used it. As you lie there, surrounded by the stillness of the night, consider how life in the medieval world was lived in stark contrast to our own. We have our own personal bedrooms, our own beds, and the luxury of privacy. But for the people of medieval times, these things weren't taken for granted. Every inch of space was valuable, and the bed was a shared commodity used for sleeping, eating, and working. In many ways, the bed became a symbol of endurance, a place where people gathered together to weather the storms of life, quite literally and figuratively. But even within this shared space, there was room for individual moments. In the darkness of the medieval room, with the fire dimming, you might hear the soft murmurs of family members talking, the quiet rustling of blankets as people shift to find comfort, and the occasional sigh of exhaustion. These small sounds, mundane as they may seem, were the soundtrack of life in the medieval world. They speak to a kind of quiet intimacy, a shared understanding that despite the discomforts and the hardships, they were all in this together. The bed became a place where the individual experience merged with the collective experience, creating a space where life could be lived, even in the most difficult of circumstances. As you settle into the warmth of your imagined bed, you feel a sense of peace wash over you. The bed may not have been luxurious, and the room may have been small and cold, but within it, there was a sense of connection, both to the people around you and to the past itself. The bed was a space of endurance, of shared moments, and of resilience. It was a place where, despite the challenges, life went on. The simplicity of the medieval bed is humbling, and as you drift into sleep, you realize that it wasn't just about the discomfort or the smallness of the space. It was about the human connections that were forged there, the warmth that was shared, and the way people found solace in the company of others. The medieval bed was a place of survival, yes, but it was also a place where people could rest, recharge, and find strength to face the next day. As you rest, the sounds of the room begin to fade into the background, and you are lulled into a peaceful sleep. You realize that, in many ways, the medieval bed was far more than just a place to sleep. It was a sanctuary of sorts, a small haven that provided warmth and comfort in the most difficult of circumstances. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in this small, shared space, you find the peace that the people of medieval times must have found. A peace born from togetherness, survival, and the quiet determination to make it through another day. The night stretches on, and the gentle sounds of the medieval world seem to fade into a soft hum, like the echoes of life itself. You feel the weight of the centuries, the sense of history wrapped up in every shift of your body, every breath that comes in time with the rhythmic ticking of the night. The medieval bed you lie in may not be the epitome of comfort by today's standards, but it has a quiet dignity to it. This small, humble space that has seen generations pass through its embrace, weathering storms and celebrating small joys alike. It's hard not to be struck by how much the medieval bed encapsulated the broader experience of life in the Middle Ages. In today's world, comfort, space, and privacy are central to how we live. But back then, life was shaped by the scarcity of those very things. People learned to adapt, to make do, and to find warmth and rest where they could. The bed became the focal point of every room, the place where people spent a great deal of their time, not just to sleep, but to connect, to work, and sometimes even to entertain. Despite its lack of luxury, the medieval bed was central to the rhythm of daily life, offering a small respite from the challenges of the outside world. As you rest in this imagined medieval bed, you begin to realize that there was a kind of beauty in the simplicity of it all. You might be lying close to others, surrounded by the rustling of blankets and the warmth of bodies, but there's a sense of shared humanity that transcends the discomfort. The bed wasn't a place of luxury. It was a place of necessity, a place where people could come together to face the cold nights and the uncertainties of life. This shared space was, in many ways, the heart of the home, providing warmth, comfort, and safety in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Think about how much time people spent in these small communal beds. They didn't just sleep there. They worked, ate, and interacted with their families, all in the same confined space. When someone in the family was ill, they stayed in bed, often surrounded by the rest of the household. There was no such thing as a private sick room. The bed, in these moments, became a space of care and compassion, where family members tended to each other, offering what little comfort they could. The idea of a sickbed was less about isolation and more about bringing everyone together to support the person in need. And in this shared experience of care and connection, the bed became a symbol of resilience. It wasn't just a place to rest. It was a place to share, to endure, and to heal. And despite the roughness of the medieval bed, there was still a kind of peace to be found there. The cold, the closeness, and the lack of space were all part of the experience, but they didn't define it entirely. The medieval bed was a place of survival, yes, but it was also a place of rest, of connection, and of shared humanity. The simplicity of the space may have made it uncomfortable, but it also brought people closer together, both physically and emotionally. It was a place where bonds were forged, where families gathered, and where life, in all its messiness, unfolded. As the night draws to a close, and you feel the gentle pull of sleep, think about how the bed in the medieval world was so much more than just a place to sleep. It was a place where life happened. A small, humble space that held within it the essence of human connection, survival, and resilience. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And in this small, shared space, people found warmth, rest, and each other. The bed was where life unfolded, and for all the discomfort it might have caused, it was also where people found solace. It was in these small, cramped spaces that people lived their lives, found comfort, and supported each other. And as you drift into sleep, surrounded by the warmth of others, you understand that the medieval bed was not just about the harsh conditions of the time. It was about how people adapted, survived, and thrived in spite of them. So, as the fire fades to embers, and the quiet of the night wraps around you, think of how far we've come. Today, we have the luxury of space, privacy, and comfort. But in the medieval world, the bed was a shared space of survival and connection. The simplicity of it all might seem uncomfortable to us now, but it was enough to carry people through the hardships of their time, just as it carries you, now in your imagined space of warmth, connection, and peace. The night stretches on, the quiet and stillness deepening as the hours pass. The medieval bed, now almost a distant memory of discomfort and survival, continues to provide its simple, albeit imperfect, embrace. You feel the weight of the darkness, the weight of history in the room. As you lie there, the sense of connection to the past feels almost tangible. The bed, though small, uncomfortable, and cramped, was central to the lives of those who lived through the medieval period. It was where they rested, where they worked, where they shared their stories, and where they spent countless hours together. In many ways, the medieval bed encapsulates so much of what defined the time. It was about endurance, about making do with what you had, and about the shared experience of life. It wasn't a place of luxury. It wasn't a place of comfort, but it was a place where people found warmth, safety, and rest amidst the challenges of the medieval world. The bed was a reflection of the times, utilitarian, simple, and essential for survival. But it was also a place where human connection could flourish. Even in the tightest, most uncomfortable of conditions, people found ways to live, to bond, and to find comfort in each other. The medieval bed might not have been a place where people experienced relaxation or peace in the way we might imagine it today, but it was a place where family, love, and resilience were forged. It was a place where moments of shared warmth, both physical and emotional, provided the strength to face the hardships of the world. And when the long, cold nights were over, the bed was there, a constant presence in the lives of medieval people, offering what little comfort it could. Imagine the scene. The family gathered close together, bodies wrapped in woolen blankets, sharing warmth amidst the cold and dampness of the room. Conversations drift in and out of the quiet, soft murmurs of voices filling the space between the creaking beams. Children fall asleep next to parents, safe in the proximity of their loved ones. The bed becomes a small sanctuary, a world unto itself, where life's trials are momentarily softened by the shared closeness of those who matter most. The bed, in these moments, is more than just a physical object. It is the anchor of the family. It is where bonds are formed, where love is shared, and where the quiet moments of the day are lived. In a time when personal privacy was scarce and every inch of space was precious, the bed became a place where the walls between people were lowered and intimacy could flourish, even amidst hardship. But the shared space of the medieval bed wasn't just about warmth. It was also about community and the unspoken understanding that everyone was in this together. In a world where danger was often lurking outside and resources were limited, the bed became a place where people found not only physical warmth, but emotional solace as well. The absence of personal space might have felt suffocating to us, but in the medieval world, it was a necessity. It was how people survived, together, relying on each other for warmth, comfort, and protection. And when the morning light finally broke through the cracks in the stone walls, and the family began to stir, it wasn't just the physical rest that had been restored. It was the emotional bonds, the shared experiences of the night that held people together, that provided the strength for the next day. The medieval bed was where people rested their bodies, but it was also where their hearts found warmth. In contrast to today's world, where personal space and private bedrooms are a given, the medieval bed reminds us of a time when everything was shared. In the cramped conditions, people found a sense of unity, of community, of family. The bed was a physical object, yes, but it was also a place where the foundations of daily life were laid. And it was in this shared space, in the intimate moments of rest, work, and conversation, that the medieval bed played its most important role. So as the night draws to a close, and the fire finally dies down to nothing more than a faint glow, you are left in the quiet of the room, resting in the shared warmth of this medieval bed. The cold may still seep through the walls, and the discomfort of the mattress may never fully go away, but in this moment, the bed has served its purpose. It has offered more than just rest. It has offered connection, community, and resilience. In this small, humble space, the people of the medieval world found a way to endure, to survive, and to live together. The room has grown eerily quiet, save for the faint crackle of the hearth as the last remnants of fire settle into the cold stone. The dim glow from the embers casts gentle shadows, and everything seems to pause as if the world outside is still. The bed, though humble and cramped, continues to cradle you, offering the last refuge for this journey through the medieval world. The shared warmth from the bodies around you provides a sense of peace, a connection to a simpler, yet far more intimate way of life. You can almost hear the soft breaths of those around you, the rhythm of life that persisted despite the discomforts. The medieval bed was not designed for luxury. It wasn't a place for deep, uninterrupted sleep or for peaceful rest after a busy day. It was a place for survival. In the harsh conditions of medieval living, where warmth was precious and personal space a luxury few could afford, the bed became a haven of sorts, not for relaxation, but for connection. It was a place where life unfolded in all its rawness and intimacy, a space where everyone, family members, friends, even guests, gathered together, not just to sleep, but to exist. In many ways, the shared nature of the medieval bed reflects the broader culture of the time. The Middle Ages were defined by tight-knit communities where people lived and worked in close quarters, sharing resources, responsibilities, and even their private spaces. Privacy wasn't a given. It was something that was earned and, for most, it was nearly non-existent. The medieval bed, though it may have seemed like a simple place for rest, was a powerful symbol of this communal way of life. It was a space where bonds were formed, where warmth was shared, and where people found solace in each other's presence. As you lie there, surrounded by the quiet sounds of the medieval night, you begin to understand the significance of these shared spaces. The bed wasn't just for sleep. It was where families lived, where they connected, and where they survived together. The medieval bed, in all its discomfort, provided more than just a physical refuge. It was a space of emotional and communal connection. It was a place where people found warmth in the most literal sense, and in the figurative sense, where they found each other. The darkness surrounding you now is the same kind of darkness medieval people faced every night. But in the medieval world, darkness wasn't just something to endure. It was something to be embraced. The night provided an opportunity for rest, for reflection, and for the simple pleasures of being close to those you loved. The medieval bed, as small and uncomfortable as it may have been, offered this one simple thing: connection. It was where you went to rest your body, but more importantly, it was where you went to find your place in the world, to rest in the shared warmth of your family and community. As you lie there, you start to realize that the bed itself was not just a physical object. It was a symbol of everything that defined medieval life: community, survival, and endurance. It was a reminder that comfort and privacy were luxuries that could not be taken for granted. But it was also a place where people found joy, connection, and a sense of belonging. The medieval bed, humble and unadorned, held the lives and stories of those who lived in it, and through them, it became a powerful symbol of what it meant to be human. The soft sounds of the room continue to lull you into a peaceful state. The medieval world, with all its challenges and discomforts, fades into the background, replaced by the warmth and security that the shared bed offered. Despite the hardships, people lived, loved, and found ways to endure. The bed, small and cramped as it was, provided not just a place to rest, but a space for survival, connection, and resilience. As you drift further into sleep, you realize that the medieval bed, in all its imperfections, was far more than just a place to sleep. It was a space where life happened, where people came together, and where they found comfort and connection, even in the harshest of circumstances. It was in these moments of closeness and shared warmth that the medieval bed truly came to life. And in this small, humble space, you find peace, knowing that the struggles of the medieval world were met with endurance, love, and an unwavering sense of community. Now, as you slip into sleep, the quiet of the medieval night embraces you. The cold, the discomfort, the noise, they all fade away as the warmth of the shared space envelopes you, and you, like those before you, rest in the unity of the moment. The medieval bed, though it may seem a far cry from the comfort of modern life, was a space where people found strength, warmth, and connection, no matter the circumstances. And now you rest, just as they did, in the comfort of shared experience and enduring connection.